Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you very much. It's really great to be here at Notre Dame and to see all of you and to meet many of you just in a few minutes when I was walking in. It's just incredible to hear about your different projects. And what I always really like talking about crisis mapping is that it really tends to assemble quite a unique interdisciplinary sort of crowd. And as I talk, I wonder if we're creating sort of collectively some kind of interdisciplinary new field around some of these ideas. So as Joe said, and I'm just going to say for the camera, my name's Jen Zemke, and I'm co-founder of the International Network of Crisis Mappers, and I'm a professor teaching political science at John Carroll University, International Relations, and a fellow at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Something incredible is happening because we have new technology and also new social practices around the use of technology that is changing our world. Many people have cell phones. They are familiar with Google Maps. There's been an incredible rise in participatory mapping. And what it's enabling us to do is to tell in real time our story. So whatever story we might have, we can text it, we can tweet it, we can put it through social media or various other devices, and it can appear on a map. And a map is an interesting way to visualize stories because one element of all stories is they happen in a certain place at a certain time. So we can actually create live crisis maps that tell powerful stories. This is a picture of some colleagues working at UNDP in Darfur in Western Sudan. They were collecting stories from survivors, and they found that people were very more willing, in fact, to tell their story, whatever it was, when they could draw it on a map by hand. So people were creating their own maps and using maps to tell a story. Here's an example of a really recent crisis map that is currently ongoing. It's created by some colleagues and friends that are working at Syria Tracker. As many of you know, there's lots of horrible atrocities happening right now in Syria. And so people using this Ushahidi crowd map are able to document and record what happened to them and place that information on a map, saying, this is what's happened to me. My brother was killed. There was a riot outside. Something exploded out the window. I was tortured. And think of the powerful witness that such a map can make. So here's an example of Ushahidi's crowd map. Ushahidi, in many ways, is the one of the reasons why crisis mapping is so successful and becoming worldwide in use is because this is a free and open source software that comes from Kenya. This is a Kenyan nonprofit software technology company. And what they enable you to do is to create any map with any extent that you like, centered on whatever location, and have different kinds of dots and different kinds of categories to correspond with that information. It was used in 2007 and 2008 to document and hopefully to prevent some violence breaking out after the elections in Kenya. But it's since been used in tens of thousands of different ways, including capturing eyewitness accounts from Syria as to what is happening on the ground. Another interesting kind of crisis map that I think is very new, actually, is very interesting, is this is Somalia Speaks, which is being deployed by Al Jazeera. So because this is a free and open source software that's in the crowd, anyone can take a crowd map and create it for whatever purpose you might want to imagine. So what this essentially does, in my mind as a social scientist, is it helps sort of narrow the gap between this imaginary us and this imagined them. Or it helps really have Somalians themselves tell their story. And when I was going through many of these stories, it was fascinating to see, people saying some of the same things that I have concerns about. Like, I'm really concerned I don't have a job, or unemployment in my area is difficult, and then now it's time for a coffee. And I think, yep, now it is time for a coffee. So after all, we're a bit more similar than we are different, isn't it the case, always? And so we have this power in crowdsourced crisis map data. We can leverage SMS, YouTube, Twitter, and all of this is incoming data flow at high volume. And we can use maps as one way to creatively visualize and understand what's happening on the ground. Indeed, I'm speaking here about an entire ecosystem of remote assistance, not just the Crisis Mappers Network. We now have over 3,000 members in every country in the world, representing some 1,500 organizations. But even that is not comprehensive. It's our friends at OpenStreetMap and at the Standby Task Force, at GIS Corps, Crowdflower, and on, Map Action, Geeks Without Bounds, Crisis Commons. These and many others are working with local communities as well as international institutions, NGOs, military. The sky goes on in terms of the number of people affecting this. But I was asked today really provide an introduction to crisis mapping. In particular, I wanted to gear this talk, because there's much to say, I wanted to gear this talk around how you as students might get involved. And the first thing I wanted to say is the process is not automated. There's plenty of space all along this chain for you to hear your voice or to participate in crisis mapping. One is just by telling your own story. But we need actually lots of volunteers. It's really an all-hands-on-deck problem when you have massive amounts of data coming in that could be placed on a map. But it's not automatically appearing on a map. And I think a lot of people think when they see a crisis map that it's automatic. This is a picture of the co-founder of the International Network of Crisis Mappers, my colleague Patrick Meyer's living room in the first few hours after the earthquake that hit Haiti in 2010. He sent out a message saying, is anyone around? Can anyone just bring their laptop if you want to help? And we can try to create a live crisis map of Haiti. And so his friends at Tufts University at the Fletcher School came by. They were on their winter holiday break. And so eventually this scaled up to where the entire basement at Tufts University in one of the buildings was full of people streaming in from all over trying to help. And this was just one of many centers all around the world, sort of ad hoc collaboration around trying to do what we could do to facilitate an improved operational picture of Haiti to help perhaps affect disaster response on the ground. Haitians themselves learned about this place in Boston, and so people living in the diaspora were logging onto their computers at home, translating SMS text messages. We were on the incoming end of over 80,000 text messages from people in Haiti, mostly asking for food and water, for tents, occasionally trapped under the rubble. And they could text their needs for free if they were inside Haiti to this number 4636. But most of these messages that were coming in are coming in Haitian Creole, and most of the volunteers that Patrick's and others sort of ad hoc were assembling in Toronto and Boston and New York and London and Cleveland were English speakers and didn't know Haitian Creole. And so this is where the power of localized information is important. You might have knowledge right now that's in your head that will save a life, because maybe you're the only one that knows exactly where you grew up. You know the roads exactly how they are in your head, or where you live now. You know the language where you grew up. And this critical information was saving lives in the weeks and days after the earthquake in Haiti, as far away as Boston, Massachusetts. So the Haitian diaspora was being used to help crowdsource the translation via our friends at Crowdflower. So people could log on at work with their computer and maybe at lunchtime take one message and translate it from Haitian Creole to English. And then that ensured that there was this constant turnover of messages that then could be mapped by volunteers here at the Fletcher School, but also around the world. As you can imagine, this rapidly scaled. And most people are not pictured, but instead are talking on Skype chats, using shared Google Docs, and doing their best to create this most comprehensive map of live situation in Haiti. And it kept changing every 5 minutes. This was a different map. If you click on 941, if you zoom in, that means 941 individual reports are in that area. So if you zoom in, it becomes disaggregated to individual reports that then can be disaggregated according to the exact kind of menace or problem or hazard on the ground. But of course, none of this is possible unless we had our friends at OpenStreetMap. right? You can't find the location of someone trapped under the rubble if they text you and say, I'm on the corner of this street and this street. And you look and look and look through Bing and Google Maps and OpenStreetMaps, and it's not marked on any road. It's not marked on any map. And so what happens when it is the case that most of Western Port-au-Prince and all commercially and publicly available maps was blank, where people were actually living? It looked as if no one lived here. And so our good friends at OpenStreetMap swarmed on this problem. OpenStreetMap is a free and open source Wikipedia-style map. It started out as a blank map of the entire world, and people, one edit at a time, are creating a really great, comprehensive, free and open source map. And so people that had never been to Haiti were able to log on, and by using satellite imagery, could trace the roads that they saw that were on the satellite image, but were not on the map. And then Haitians themselves could come and write the road names. So I wanted to show you very quickly this animated. Has anybody seen this before? Okay. So this is an animation of, this is Haiti, this is the Port-au-Prince area, of the edits that were taking place in the days and weeks after the quake. So this red line, this is when the earthquake hits Haiti. The humanitarian OpenStreetMap team realized its people all around the world, far away as Indonesia, were logging on, staying up all night in order to create these edits so that we could have a decent map, so that we could find exactly the roads and hospitals and clinics and everything that we needed to find, helping save lives. So this, I think, illustrates well the power of the crowd and what can happen if we all work together.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
So I'm assuming the cell phone companies were not willing to provide the locations of these individuals, because if the GPRS phones and at least a cell phone tower would have been a reasonable approximation.
Right, so the question is whether the cell phone companies were able to release the location information, and they weren't. I don't know if it was privacy concerns, but the volunteers on this side did not have any idea where the people were located. And so we were literally looking through everything we could find, using even like antiquated tourist maps. I mean, we pulled down every map we could find. We were looking at Google Maps, Bing, OpenStreetMap, looking like and sometimes like a needle in a haystack. But what was wonderful is when members of the Haitian diaspora, cab drivers, people that knew the streets of Port-au-Prince like the back of their hand, could walk into this place in Boston and say, that's it, that's the corner, that's where they are. And we would get the latitude, longitude coordinates and go from there. So crisis maps can help provide operational humanitarian support for acute crises and natural disasters and conflicts and oil spills and tornadoes and snowstorms. It's always amazing to me to see the different applications that can be used. Google also has taken it upon themselves to do this great service whenever there's a massive disaster like the earthquake hit Haiti or the 2011 Japan earthquake, is they set up Person Finder, where if you have information about a person that is lost, but maybe they're in the hospital and you know they're there, it can be used to help connect them to loved ones that are looking for those people. So there's lots of different kinds of work in this ecosystem. It's not all one program or one platform. It's really a process of emergence that we saw in around 2008, which is many different people are starting to work in a similar space, and we think that there's at least a reason to have dialogue, and that's why we had the first conference on crisis mapping in Cleveland in 2009. It was just this idea that lots of people are doing something interesting and similar, and let's bring everyone together maybe to catalyze innovation in this space. But crisis maps can also be used for many other things besides and beyond humanitarian disasters. Here is a map of Harassment Map that's based in Cairo, trying to call attention to gender-based violence, harassment, and other kinds of problems in the streets of Cairo. There's many applications of using maps to record conflict. And the original application for which Ushahidi was designed was to monitor elections, intimidation and harassment around elections, and also violence that sometimes happens when you put an election in a deeply divided society. Sometimes that election can really act as a powder keg. And so many times elections can have that destabilizing element. So this is one way of basically providing a witness or testimony. A map is a witness or testimony to abused political systems. So people can take pictures of ballots being burned out back and upload them to a map and say, see, this is not a free and fair election. Yeah.
What kind of assurances does the end user receive or feel about their own privacy and anonymity being preserved? Because I can imagine the fear of an IP being traced or a cell phone number being logged by Big Brother that they're reporting against, right? So how do you build the trust that or is there such assurance even possible?
This is a really important question about how can you ensure the safety and security and privacy of individuals that are reporting on the map. And I can say that's the main issue that's being talked about these days in crisis mapping at conferences. Is the issue of security and privacy is a very serious one. There are certain measures that you can take to operate secure browsers, but I think it's important that people know when they're reporting about the possibility that that can give away their identity, even if they believe they're reporting it anonymously and they're not using their name and so on. But there's a lot of people, even that we've talked to, that are putting up allegations, say, about what's happening currently in Syria, and the people themselves are fully aware of the risks, but they're doing it anyway because they believe that maybe this can be some sort of documentation against the atrocities that's happening. But it's a very serious issue. And so we have a whole working group set up for that. This is an example of the oil spill. So it's also possible for people to map hazardous environmental conditions and events. And so crisis maps can also be used to detect human rights violations from the sky. So there's whole groups of people working in satellite imagery and also grassroots imagery and public UAVs and other kinds of kites and balloons in order to capture imagery from the ground, before and after pictures that can show testament of, okay, we see the tanks are rolling south in Sudan. We see evidence of mass graves, or in the case that this is a picture, before and after picture of Zimbabwe, in which there's documentation of forced eviction. So the government can say nobody was forcibly evicted here, but the satellite imagery or the aerial photo says something else. And so many people are working in this area of trying to deter atrocities by using images and maps as evidence that could even be one day used at the International Criminal Court. And friends at the public laboratory are using balloons and kites to make their own satellite images. Some of the best images made of the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico were made by this group that stitched together lots of little pictures taken from very cheap and inexpensive cameras aloft, balloons made of garbage bags filled with helium or kites. And so for less than $100, you can have pretty decent satellite imagery. And that's, of course, important because satellite imagery is often very difficult to obtain, expensive, and out of the reach of many citizen activists. Others are using crisis maps in order to point out points of pride in their community or community resilience. I teach a course on crisis mapping. The students this semester decided to map what are the location of the urban gardens in our community. So I live in Cleveland, there's lots of brown lots, there's a lot of foreclosed homes, there's lots of poverty and urban blight, but there's also some ways in which there's resilience in the community. There's one of the most thriving kinds of urban gardens of anywhere, and so crisis maps can do many different kinds of things. But one of the most exciting things that Joe actually alluded to already is that it helps the crowd connect with itself. In a mass disaster, you can't rely on traditional urban search and rescue teams or first responders to save everyone. They're just completely overwhelmed. So most people in Haiti, I'm sure, were saved by their neighbors rather than, you know, on TV with some USAR teams. And that's because there's just massive power in connecting people to others that can help. Here's an early example of how crisis maps are moving now to not only showing the problems, but also some of the solutions. So this was a map of Washington, D.C. They're not used to the snow like we are here in this part of the world. And so just a little bit of snow and they can't dig out. But this was actually during Snowmageddon, where they had really, truly lots of snow in New York and Washington. And so they were mapping where were the cars stuck, where was the power out, and who needed help and assistance. And so people were also able to put on this map offers of help. I've got a shovel to share. I've got a way to get you to the hospital, a truck that can get there, something like this. And so Ushahidi also has in its capability the ability for people to receive text backs and alerts on their cell phones. So if you want to know what's happening in your area along a certain line, you can say, okay, within 5, 10, 20 kilometers of me, I want to know, I want to be texted when any of these kinds of things happen. And this is just the start. This is very new, and it's just the start. In response to some concerns after Haiti from traditional seasoned humanitarian response organizations like UN OCHA, the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, they said, well, what happened in Haiti was pretty remarkable. Lots of volunteers spent thousands and thousands of hours staying up all night doing what they could do to crisis map. But will you always be there? I mean, was it something special about Haiti because it was always on the news every day that everybody was pouring out their heart? Can we come to rely on this new data flow for other kinds of disasters? And in response to that concern, the Standby Task Force was launched at the second Conference on Crisis Mapping in 2010. In the fall. And it's quickly grown. It has about 700 volunteers in many countries all around the world. You can see a map of their location here. And this is one way that many of you might be interested in considering joining or helping. This is an online volunteer community for live mapping. So what would happen if you join the Standby Task Force is you would set up, you would first receive lots of training and instruction according to the group that you're in. So the Standby Task Force does well in putting people in relevant groups. So you can be a media monitor, you can be on the tech team or the task team or language translation, depending on your skills and where your best value added might be. And then there's training sessions, and then we're kind of united in multiple, 100 people in a room kind of Skype chats, where people ask questions and offer advice and support to one another. And we use a lot of Google Docs that are constantly being updated, but it's very step-by-step. So you just log on to the Google Doc. If you're on the media monitoring team, it'll say, okay, step 1, open your browser. Step 2, look at this Twitter feed. Step 3, if you find a report, make a report by this way. And so it's pretty straightforward, and it's one great way to get involved. Another way is to join the International Network of Crisis Mappers or have a look at the website. We have over 100 videos, 5-minute videos on the cutting edge of crisis mapping, not just in the things that I've talked about, but all the many other important work that's happening in this space. And we also offer webinars and other events here. And so that's it, and I look forward to your questions. Anything? Yeah.
It's fascinating because you really crowdsourced a lot of things to get the end result, right? I mean, as I understand it, you crowdsourced the making of a map, right? You crowdsourced getting the Twitter feeds from locals about where the crisis was, the events, right? You crowdsourced the translation of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, did you crowdsource the interpretation of them, or like, how did it get? You have the text where the location is. Now they got to put a pin on the map. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
How did that process occur? I'm also wondering, when you crowdsource all these different things, how they dovetail together. And also, I'm a little wondering whether any of this was automated once you got the crowd's information, or does somebody have to go through for each text and kind of say, here's the final one, we're going to put the mark there on the map? I'm trying to get the last part.
Okay, it's a great question, remarking first that there's a lot of different ways in which crowdsourcing is actually being used. Here we have crowdsourcing the information in the first place from Twitter feeds and crowdsourcing the translation. But yes, we're using in some way crowdsourcing or volunteer sourcing or team sourcing for putting these dots on a map. Like I say, it's not automatic. In fact, there was an awful lot of cut and paste, like mind numbing. I remember thinking myself, if I could just turn myself into a machine, this would be faster. Why should I stand in the way of this process? But that's because it was ad hoc, it was very new, it was the first time that anybody had tried to create a live crisis map in real time. And so before the 4636 number was set up, we had people looking at Twitter, looking at CNN, looking at Al Jazeera, looking at as many sources, YouTube, as they could, and then others just cutting and pasting and putting that information into the body of the report. And then we had a whole other team looking to try to find where's the location, to get an exact latitude, longitude coordinate for that dot. And then we had people on the back end also verifying reports and assigning a level of credibility. Do we think that
So you
this...
had teams in addition, like, I mean, they were more than volunteers, like, they were still,
Yeah.
but they were not the crowd for the special activities where you had to aggregate or figure out, this is really where it should go, or this is where.
Right. So in the beginning, it was Patrick trying to do this himself. And then he said, this is not sustainable. So then he called his friends and he said, does anyone want to help? Come to my room and I'll train you. And everybody said, well, I'm not a geographer. I don't know GIS. He said, no, if you can sort of point and click and use a mouse, you can help. And so then naturally, in an ad hoc sort of emergent way, it really grew into being kind of naturally, well, I'm going to focus on just looking at location, and you can do the cut and paste, and you can look through the Twitter feed. And so through a process of trial and error and constant sort of updating, how can we make this process faster and more effective and more efficient? Then that's what happened. And that's part of the reason for the Standby Task Force, was to take some of the lessons learned from Haiti and make it a constantly evolving document. So now people know when they join, I'm joining the media monitoring team, or I'm joining the verification team or the tasking team. But in the beginning, you just show up with your laptop and you're trying to do it all. But we realized that wasn't the most efficient way. So that's a good question. Yeah?
To follow up on that about automation, is there any utilization of programs that things like Google have used for tracking the spread of disease like H1N1? They would look for just keywords in Twitter feeds and Facebook and things like that to see the spread of the disease as people start commenting on things that are happening around them or their coworkers getting sick and stuff. And if there is a way then to track the IP of the person that posted that feed, and then you can then get a location.
Mm-hmm. So I'm confident that more automation is on the way and is actually there in many respects. And in some respects, epidemiology has been ahead of the game, because in terms of tracking disease, the Health Map and other colleagues working in this area on the cholera outbreak in Haiti have different kinds of methods and protocols. But I think that it's getting maybe to the point where the machine can do more of the work, but the human can still be in the loop in terms of verifying and vetting and making sure that it's not going wrong. And I think that would be the ideal, is if, less cut and paste, less sort of looking through to see where is this road, and more automation and more fine-tuned systems. And I think not just, there's so many different programs, it's not just Ushahidi, and they're all, I think, in a different state or level, but that's a good question. Mm-hmm.
Kind of on the application of this. So once you have your maps, are you trying to have kind of aid groups like the Red Cross use them, or is it more like government?
Yeah.
Based, and like what's the level of acceptance by the groups that actually can do the help?
Right, so it's a great question about end users and who are the end users in this process. And for an Ushahidi crowd map, it's the person that decided to create the map. It can be any person or individual. It can be a large organization or institution. For example, UN OCHA launched the Libya crisis map, which was a real-time map of the events taking place in Libya, because they said we didn't have as much information as we would have liked as to what was happening on the ground, and so they wanted to put all that information in one place. Where are refugees going? Where are the food and water requests? So as to identify gaps in that space. There's a different level of acceptance by different organizations. So different organizations feel quite differently about this. All organizations have existing data flows and have existing models, incident command systems, or different ways of dealing with a disaster or an event. And some are a bit reticent to accept new flows and sources of data, whereas others are really embracing it. But I think all are interested and curious about this and how it fits in and how it fits in, and is it inherently disruptive to the process, or is it something that with a few minor modifications can actually assist? It's up for debate.
Kind of going along with that, after you have, like, say someone says, hey, I'm trapped under rubble on this block, whatever, is there any way to, like, I guess, indicate when that person has been responded to? I mean, does the pin come off the map, or is it still there kind of in the aggregate collective data? That's
a great question about can we show that an event has finished? Is there a way to take a pin off a map? Dave Lang, who works in Samoa, has requested that Ushahidi create a different kind of map in which, instead of having the dots on the map with the different colors, let's see if I can find a decent map. Essentially, the color would turn different colors depending on its status. So maybe it shows up green, and then depending on the incident and what's happening, it can maybe be texted directly to the first responders that are going out to the event. And you can ask, okay, we've got this event. Can you take it, yes or no, and in what time? And then the individual can also get some sort of response back, like, we'll be there, hold on, we'll be there within 6 hours or whatever. And then after a certain length of time has passed, it'll turn yellow, and then it'll turn red, and then it will turn flashing red, like someone really has to get to this. Is just different ways of coping with this question. And then having the ability to take the dot off in a way is also very important. Another important feature of Ushahidi, it's not a static map in the sense that you can look at any screenshot and snapshot of time if you want. So you can sort of play it and animate it through space and time so that you can see what's happened in terms of understanding the dynamics and patterns for a different time. That's part of it. Yeah.
I may be ignorant, but I didn't really know what crisis mapping was. So how do the people know, like, to text 4636? Like, how does...
Right. So nobody knew really to text 4636 because it never happened before. And so it was through use of the local community radio and word of mouth that people had the information in Haiti that they could text 4636. But that was only in the Haitian case. So it's not that in every disaster there's an SMS number to call. That takes, of course, companies that are willing to provide that service for free. It takes some doing, but it was used again in the floods in Pakistan and in some other cases where they set up a number, or you could set up an email. It really very much depends on the deployment, because as you can imagine, if you're mapping sexual harassment in Cairo, it's very different from an earthquake in Haiti or floods and tsunamis in Pakistan or Samoa. And so you have different situations, and so the people creating the map can create a different kind of method by which, you can send a message to this number or send a report to this email or tweet under this hashtag and we'll get it on the map for you. But getting that information out there, I think one of the main media is Twitter. So there's a lot of people in the Twitter sphere that are learning about crisis mapping. And what's been amazing for me to watch over time is how the crowd has learned it can set up its own map, at least the crowd using Twitter. Because what I've seen after the explosions hit Mumbai last year, instantly there were about 10 maps. And so actually the problem is everybody's creating a crowd map right away. And there's there's a couple spreadsheets open and people are putting their information. And so now the crowd is sort of gradually learning through Twitter, because that's where the world goes to talk really, who's making the map? And then let's shut down these other ones so we can all focus around one map. But it's very much a dynamic, sort of emergent process from the ground in terms of these sort of crowdsourced projects.
So have you considered a crisis map app, if you will? That I'm in a crisis, I basically go to my app and I hit the submit button, whatever the cause may be, and that picks up my location. Then you have much more precise location as a result of that.
Yeah, I do think so. And there's a good project that's based out of Taiwan, OpenGeoSMS. And Slayer Chang is working on such an app. And I haven't seen it work myself, but I think he has some very much some feasibility in terms of texting and using it also with first responders, but the crowd, and it's going automatically to the map. So I think that's very much at the cutting edge. And there's lots of, I think, different groups racing to get in similar places. But free and open source will win, right? Because it's hard to compete with the free and open source model. So if you lock it under a key, even if you've created a great app, it's I think something quite different. Yeah.
A lot of flowers are blossoming all over the place. I mean, in addition to crisis mappers, there's many other organizations
Yes.
that are doing this. Like I was just familiar with one that's active in Chicago, Crisis Commons.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a coordinating organization that is trying to bring all of these different people together? For
Yep.
Crisis mapping seems to be focused on maps, but then there's other tools that don't necessarily involve maps, like you mentioned the Creole translation, for example.
Right.
I know the Crisis Commons people participated in some of that.
Yeah, I wanted to tip my hat to others in the ecosystem because it truly is a collaborative effort, and I think each has their niche. It's not as competitive as one might imagine because Crowdflower is crowdsourcing the translation. Map Action is doing wonderful work in country with maps, and GIS Core is making great analytic reports. So I think there's a different space for all of these different volunteer and technical communities. But as for the question of whether they're collaborating and how, I would say that it's, again, an ad hoc emergent process where we're learning of each other and then we're incorporating them into our understanding of what exists. At the last conference of crisis mappers, which was in Geneva, Switzerland a few months ago, we had the opportunity to meet at a side meeting of the UN OCHA and also at the side meeting of UN Outer Space Affairs Office. And I think it was really the first time that many from these communities were all together, and we recognized the need of maybe having a, not a formal structure, but just a formal understanding of how one activates the other one and who's doing what. And it's already the process of learning, at least among the leadership, if you want to say. We're all very sort of flat, horizontal organizations. We're not hierarchies. But I think that we all recognize one another's strengths and are definitely working together quite a bit. And I think in the future will only be more so. Either.
I think it's important to mention the tight coupling with the free and open source software community. So Ushahidi or CrowdMap, which is the cloud deployment, and Frontline SMS, OpenStreetMaps. I think the free and open source software community is a key ingredient here, and it wouldn't be able to happen without it.
Yep.
Very open, transparent community.
Yep, absolutely. I think that that's in many ways the reason that this has been so successful is the importance of the free and open source software community. The network has many different organizations involved. So we have Google and we have ESRI and we have many different organizations having a conversation. But I think that in terms of where the operational cutting edge, a lot of times it's already the free and open source. But there's a lot of collaboration. I mean, Google is doing some interesting work with Person Finder, for example. So in some ways, we're trying with the conference to be a neutral space where we can at least have the dialogue and the debate and the idea that everyone has something to offer. And yeah, people do have to pay their bills somehow, and there's different models for how one does that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm a little interested. I don't want to be negative. It's on error and how you deal with errors, and the different types of errors. And
Yeah.
the system could be fine One is the error that an event occurred but you located incorrectly or something like that. I'm wondering, the verification procedure. But the other ones are event occurs, but it's never located. I mean, it's never known, right? It exists, but you don't know because the crowd hasn't gotten to that space. And the other ones are the errors where it is known, but it's not true, right? Somebody reports a false situation. So do you have any ways did you see a lot of these things?
Yeah. I mean, the question is about error, and I would say that from a statistical perspective, certainly this is very troubling, right? We know the dog that doesn't bark. Do we know what our universe of cases would be? Do we know? The very difficult questions, but on the last of the three, when you were talking about verification in terms of false information making its way on a map, there are some ways we can mitigate this problem, which is Ushahidi has within its capability for the folks on the back end to provide some sort of level of verification information around the specific report. In one dimension, it's around the source. So do we trust the source? Is this a friend of mine that's on the ground? If so, they would have maybe a higher rating. Because these crowd maps sometimes can be used in closed settings. It's not always a crowdsourced model, because you can imagine a really dangerous setting where maybe you populate a community with 20 cell phones and you report on violence, let's say in eastern DRC, for example. There's Voice of the Kivus is working on some of this, which is that they're giving 25 local people their own cell phone, trusted, show them how to do it, and that information is only coming from them. It's not coming from the crowd, so that we would expect the level of validity and verification to be higher. And there's also ways in this map to completely exclude anything from Twitter just off the top. So you're only looking at CNN reports and Al Jazeera reports. You can exclude the source of social media, and then you can compare and contrast. The other way to evaluate faulty information is to select a level of probability according to the information itself. So maybe you don't know anything about the source, but you can look at the information and does it sort of make sense? And this is a very subjective process, of course, but does it seem really unlikely? Is it completely untrue? And this is at the back end for the administrator to be able to delete reports that are sort of clearly just, say, hate speech or something that you don't want to appear on the map. So that's one way, but it is a concern and something that we're talking about. But I think that
for the other ones, feedback to the crowd that places on the map we have no dots or anything, maybe it's not being covered, right? As opposed to there's no
right.
incidences, and say, has anybody heard? I don't know.
Right.
You can see this crowd self-correct the information. For example, during election time, factcheck.org, and I report on CNN and rely on a rumor comes up, and 10 people go in and correct it, and the facts are established. So.
Yeah, it's fascinating to watch a process of self-correction on Twitter as well, which is if a rumor is out, let's say before Gaddafi died, a couple weeks before he died, there's a rumor, oh, Gaddafi's dead. But then after a few hours, minutes, whatever the case, when it comes out that that's actually not true, then the whole Twitter sphere is please retweet this. This was a rumor. Right, and so there's a certain, sometimes we have a way of self-correcting. It's kind of interesting to watch through Twitter. But sometimes, of course, it can just amplify the bias. Yeah. So it's not 100% corrective. But I personally tend to trust when there's multiple reports about the same event from many different phone numbers, from many different witnesses. You have a video, you have a picture, you have video and picture from different angles. It becomes less likely to imagine that was just staged and completely false. Yep.
Since you say that Twitter is such a big source of information, are there any crawlers available that look for hashtags and places in those tweets with the hashtags, or is it still entirely manually included?
For the Standby Task Force, as far as I know, the question about whether we are crawling through in an automated way to look through hashtags, the answer I would say is that when an event happens, no one knew in advance that it was going to happen. So an explosion hits Mumbai, so people start tweeting on hashtag Mumbai or Mumbai blasts or various things in local languages. But what happens is that there's certain people that tend to get on the horse and say, let's all tweet under this hashtag, or they try to. And so this happens, and through the use of shared Google Docs, the volunteers that are looking through Twitter as fast as they can for whatever information are pulling out, here's all the various hashtags people are using, so we have to start covering these. And then you realize that gradually what happens is a funneling process where more people start tweeting under certain hashtags rather than, I think, it's just sort of casual observation. I might be wrong, but that seems to be what happens. But I would think there's definitely space for an automated process. And I know that there are some that exist, I think, in commercial space, like DataSift and others. I haven't used them, I don't know. We're just sort of trying our best on the fly in an ad hoc way.
If I may add to that,
Yeah.
Twitter actually allows for, they call it a garden hose, 10% of the data to be available to be mined. And you have to pay a lot of money now to actually get the entire tweet down. Because only if my profile is public, I can index, and at the same time, only 10% of that is what Twitter allows. But there is people doing hashtag mining.
And what's that called?
People are doing hashtag mining. I can send you a few links, actually.
Okay, great.
They've looked at it in my group. My students have looked at that as well.
Great,
They try to stop creating based on Twitter tweets of companies.
great. Anything else? Yes?
Could you reflect on the ways that students can get involved? I know they could participate as contributors
Mhm.
in some of these crowdsourcing activities, but then also on the development side.
Absolutely. We're always looking for bright minds to broaden our perspective of what crisis mapping can be used for, or just participatory maps in general. So my students this year, some of them decided to create memorial maps of an earthquake that had hit Italy in, I think, 2006, 7, I don't remember. They created memorial maps because they were personally affected. And so there's just so many different kinds of maps. I would have never imagined a crisis map being used about an oil spill, for example. So whatever my original conception of what this could be used for has grown over time as more people have made it their own, have decided to stand up, you know, this is where we're going to recycle on campus maps, and these are the problems where there's no receptacles, or whatever the issue on campus might be. There's interesting ways to use maps, not necessarily in a crisis setting, but these crowd maps, I think, are interesting, and different social groups can create one. I mean, in less than 5-10 minutes, you can have a map, and it doesn't have to be a crisis. It can be any kind of crowdsourced map. And I think that's one way of it'd be interesting to have students brainstorm, I think, different ways they might want to use maps in their community and with their student groups. Like, is there some activity you're already doing right now for which a map might just be an interesting perspective, or something you could try once or twice, or something that's beyond that? But also for the conference, you know, we're always looking for people that want to help. Do anything. So we're all, you know, we do this, Patrick and I, as volunteers, so we have other full-time jobs. So if there's anybody that wants to do any kind of help, we're always more than happy at that level as well. So.
You mentioned your community resilience and some of the work your students are doing. Are you going to be able to publish that? Can we try to follow that? I think that's an interesting way that this can be used.
One of the ways I would start is on the crisis mapping website. If you would scroll down, this is just a screenshot, but if you would scroll down here, there's links to my syllabi and PowerPoints and student projects. And so I think that's one interesting way just to see what's currently happening. And then also there's blog posts and forum posts and information that you can search on the site to see if you want to look up garden maps or participatory maps, and then, you know, find what others are doing and find connections. That would be one way. So people are doing a lot of posting on that. I personally don't like publishing in the academic sphere because it takes too long. I mean, 20 months and the story is pretty dead. So it's been frustrating for me, and so I put a lot of things online as opposed to in the academic sphere, and that counts against tenure, of course, but what does it count for life? Maybe more. So. Other questions? I really appreciate,
Do you know of any cities that are using it to report and control crime?
There are many criminologists in this space that have been working for years with with data at an event level, micro level data. There's police departments in, I believe, Philadelphia that are doing some really advanced, interesting statistical analysis and also visualization, where they can actually predict, or they try to predict, the likelihood that, for example, burglary will happen in a certain area next week. So they have some really interesting tools where you can say, okay, based on the past, the likelihood is next Monday at noon somewhere in this, block might experience some traffic, so let's put a cop car there, right? So they're using data on homicides, murders, burglaries. Many police departments are using this, but communities are using this to try to prevent crime in a way. I mean, Syria Tracker is in some respects that way, but there's over 10,000 crisis maps now. In 2010, when Haiti was launched, there was maybe a dozen, I would say. Don't quote me on that. Sorry. But there weren't that many. But now there's over 10,000, and perhaps tens of thousands we don't even really know. So I'm sure there's many applications that I don't know about. Thank you all for your